to be connected to, these images or these aspects of the characters or the worlds.
I think what Raja talks about, he talks about resonance. And I think our thought process in developing trauma nerds was that the resonance was already there. People are already drawn to these movies and these characters already. If you already like find yourself like getting lost in D&D, or you find yourself getting lost in like X-Men, or getting lost in an RPG or something like that, then yeah, the affinity's already there. So all we're doing is kind of pointing back to the body as a person's like experiencing this resonance. Like, hey, what happens when you see the Hulk? What happens? For mine, it was Killmonger. When I was like, oh, that's interesting. That's pretty fascinating. That's why that my initial thought when we started formulating trauma nerds was going to be some character studies about like, hey, what do these characters embody in terms of fight responses, and flight responses, and how do we kind of take someone through a tour of somatics using these characters, and it evolved to all these other topics too as well. So yeah, I think the resonance between people and these characters and these stories allows for a window into like what happens in their bodies, because it's already happening implicitly already. We're just drawing their attention to it.
Yeah, and a conduit to
Yeah.
as a conduit to someone's. I mean, I remember we kind of like our working theory is a kind of like Santre therapy, right? Like that we're like anything anybody's drawn to like has some significance. Like that's our belief.
Yeah.
Period. Like without any exception.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, if that's true, then if we investigate this deeply, we can see that like, like for instance, somebody like I know Bert and I've talked a lot about like, people we're working with who play a lot of video games,
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe a traditional approach is to like, they're dissociating playing video games, or like, how do we understand the world that someone's in? Join with it and like use that as a conduit to start lacing together kind of molecule by molecule, like a sense of I have a body, and then maybe I have feelings, maybe I have a self that is like using the world that someone's in. And we really believe to really deeply educate ourselves about these worlds that are very specific. I mean, like these games are whole universes.
Mm-hmm. They're vast in a sense. Like the example we use sometimes is when people who like really play the Zelda game Breath of the Wild, like when it first came out,
That's a good game.
Beautiful game, and people talk about the sense of wonder they got when they came out of the first initial cave in that game and saw the vastness of that world. That's exploratory orienting. Like they do a sweeping shot from the left all the way to the right, and you're inside the characters taking in this giant world, and then they kind of throw you out there. And I think that idea of like teaching folks about like the threat response cycle using this stuff, because their body already is doing it. They already sense like, oh, I felt like, oh, a sense of wonder when this happened. I felt this sense of vastness. Oh, good. Let's drop in, figure out what happened just now, because there's the reason why, at least our theory is the reason why people run to these spaces is sometimes because they don't have that same space anywhere else. So the resilience of their entire psyche is they're like, oh, if I can't find it here in this place, in this family structure or this environment or the society, I will find one and make one. I will find characters who are stand-ins. I will find environments that are the literal counter vortex to what it is you're experiencing. And I think, like any good SCP, you want to find out what's going on in that counter vortex,
Yeah. Yeah, and the counter vortex, just for people who aren't SE trained, there's a movement between a trauma vortex and a counter vortex, which creates the healing. And the counter is in the sort of the mainstream of life. It's where there's more resources. It's kind of helps people to feel more of who they are. They may have some sort of positive association to it as well, but we often will kind of stabilize in that counter vortex, and then we'll go into the trauma vortex or into more traumatic sensations or associations, and then sort of help facilitate this movement back and forth. And, I often think though, that in this orienting, let's say, we have the exploratory orienting, and then we have defensive orienting, first things in that threat response cycle. And video games are great, right? Because they do really engage the whole threat response cycle, and you're engaged in completion, right? Usually end up with some kind of reward as well. And it's so there's all kinds of ways that your motor maps are firing out, even just as you're playing with your fingers.
Mm-hmm.
But that ability to orient, if you can invite someone to feel the sensations and the emotions and that interoception, felt sense of the awareness of that, it starts to create a foundation on the inside, like a neural template, we could call it, or a physiological template, to start to find places to do it on the outside, even if it's a tree in a yard, in an urban environment, even if it's just a moment of looking at a cloud in the sky, right? And even under a lot of adverse situations and conditions, that it's the beginning of some of those possibilities, because it's from here that it emerges out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think too, like, you think about, like, I think there's some pushback a little bit in the like nerdverse or these kind of cultural or pop things, that like somehow those are not as genuine as, like, say, a tree or like outside. Now, there is a lot of benefits about being outside.